Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this installment of the new National Climate Assessment Roundtable Series. My name is Larry Perez with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program, and right off the bat, I will let you know that today's roundtable is being live captioned with the kind assistance of Fed Relay. So, if you'd like to take advantage of captioning today, just use the link that we're going to share in the chat box down below in the webinar interface now. This roundtable series is really intended to deliver area-specific information to units across the National Park System within each of the 10 National Climate Assessment regions. The roundtables are opportunities to learn about the latest findings from the 2018 assessment, to ask questions of subject matter experts, and to have a dialogue with NPS leaders that are actively working on climate change issues within their respective parks. And we encourage your participation today. Today's roundtable is going to focus exclusively on parks within the Midwest region of the assessment. If you happen to be calling in from an area outside this area, we still very much welcome your participation today. Previous and subsequent installments of this series focus on additional regions throughout the country. And we have recordings of all our past events and a full schedule of upcoming roundtables that can be found at the link that we're also going to post down below in the chat box right now. As part of today's call, we're going to be hearing shortly from Dr. Jim Angel on findings, impacts, and actions from the 4th National Climate Assessment. We'll follow that up with a brief question and answer period. We'll then have short presentations from several invited guests from parks within the Midwest region, and we'll conclude the broadcast promptly at 4:30 p.m. Central Time. I'm going to be one of two facilitators for today's roundtable. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Melanie Wood, who will be helping us manage our tech today in the background. And speaking of the tech, just a few quick words about the functionality before we begin. All the functionality of the webinar interface is accessed through this tiny toolbar. If the panels aren't already visible, you can access them by clicking on the right arrow button at the top of the toolbar. Be aware, your panels may minimize periodically just by default, but you can set them to remain open by clicking on View along the top menu and deselecting the Auto Hide option. Your audio panel shows how you're currently connected to the webinar. For best quality, we highly recommend that you dial in by a phone rather than using your computer audio. If you're currently connected via computer audio, you can go ahead and switch over to phone audio at this time by selecting the phone radio button and just dialing back in. We have quite a number of participants online with us today, so by default, all of you have been muted just to keep background noise in check. We will, though, be taking questions during the entirety of the roundtable. Again, these roundtables are real prime opportunities for you to ask questions of our invited experts and practitioners relative to your park and the challenges that you're facing in the field. So we really welcome you to bring your voice into the room, and there are two key ways to do that today. If you have a question you'd like to voice during the webinar, simply find the raise your hand icon on the webinar interface, and we will unmute you one by one to ask your question. And just so everyone gets familiar with that functionality, I'd like to ask anyone listening right now, if you like ice cream, go ahead and raise your hand right now. Melanie, how are we looking?
Oh, we've got a few here.
I see John Snyder likes ice cream.
Carol Daniels.
Julie Christian. You're my kind of people. Pete Booty likes ice cream. I knew that. Awesome. You can use this functionality anytime during the presentation today, and Melanie's going to go ahead and lower your hands from our perch here. There's also an additional way that you can ask questions. You're welcome to submit written questions at any time during the presentation as well. To do so, just enter your text into the questions panel, as you see right on the slide. Melanie and I will monitor for incoming questions and pose them to our speakers and panelists at the very first opportunity that we have. Additionally, should you have any difficulty with the technology today, you can use the same questions panel to let Melanie and I know that. All right, with that, one final word. Today's session is being recorded for sharing after the fact via our website. So just be aware that additional live caption, we are recording the event as well. So with that, I would love to get started, and I'm very happy and excited to welcome Dr. Jim Angel as our featured speaker today. Dr. Angel has been a climate scientist for 35 years and was the state climatologist for Illinois for 20 years. His research focus is on climate issues impacting the Midwest throughout, including droughts, floods, extreme events, and climate change. Jim works a lot with stakeholders in the region, including ag producers, engineers, educators, federal and state agencies, and others. He works at the Illinois State Water Survey at the University of Illinois in Champaign. So Jim, thanks very much for taking time to join us today, and take it away.
All right. Thank you for having me. So we're going to talk today about climate change in the Midwest here, and we'll get it started up. And let's see here. Show my screen.
Thanks, Jim. I just shot you that presenter role. Excellent.
Okay. All right. All right. So today I'm going to talk about the National Climate Assessment. And as Larry said, we'll focus in on the Midwest here. And I'll first just let me comment that, today is, if you're watching this live on November 12th, it's probably one of the coldest days we've had in a long time. In fact, very early cold air outbreak across the central part of the U.S. Here's a map of the United States, or actually a global map, showing the temperature departures. So thank you, Larry, for inviting me on the coldest day of the year to talk about global warming. But the point of this map is that while we are very cold in the central United States today, there are other parts of the world that are actually quite warm. You go up to Alaska or the West Coast or Greenland or Africa or Europe, any of those places that are in the warmer shades of yellow and orange are experiencing above normal temperatures today. So they actually more than cancel out the cold air that we've got here in the Midwest. So I just wanted to address the elephant in the room on that one. So this National Climate Assessment is something that's mandated by Congress, and they're supposed to report every 4 years. It's usually been a little longer than that, but it's been going on since 1990. There's 13 federal agencies involved, and about 300 authors as well. And some of them are federal, but we also have several from universities and private groups as well. Try to get a good representation across the board in terms of identifying experts across the entire field of climate change. It took 2 years of writing and reviews. I would say this holds the record by far as the most reviewed document that I've ever worked on. I think last count I had, there was about 8 revisions of this based on input from both inside the federal government and outside the federal government. So it's highly reviewed and highly vetted. And I'll just show this real quick. I can always come back to it later in the recording, so I just wanted to acknowledge the co-authors in the Midwestern report. And you can see a quick glance here that we've got folks from federal agencies such as NOAA and also universities across the Midwest. And pretty much everybody on here is either in the Midwest or has close ties to the Midwest. They actually have personal knowledge of climate and weather events in the Midwest. And when we talk about the Midwest today, we're talking about this 8-state region identified here. And it also includes the Great Lakes. Since we were the region that was had the largest portion of the Great Lakes in our region, we inherited the whole thing. So even though the Northeast also has Great Lakes, we were the ones that focused on that. So today we're going to talk about observed climate change and potential future risk, and give some examples of adaptation strategies that we see going on in the Midwestern region. And let me just say, just kind of get some brief background here. This is the global temperatures at the Earth's surface since the 1880s to present. And the blue bars are departures from the long-term average. So I take an average of that entire period. If it's a blue bar, it's below the long-term average. It's a red bar, it's above the long-term average. You can see it bounced around. It was fairly cool in the first part of the 20th century, kind of bounced around the middle part of the 20th century. But the part that's really gotten our attention is the last 30 to 40 years, where you've seen this steady increase in global temperatures. And the gray line there is the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, and those pretty much match the upward march and the annual temperatures there. So that's pretty straightforward. If you look at the United States, there are some areas that are getting warmer faster than other areas. This is the annual temperature on the top panel, and then we got winter and summer. And you can see the impacts of the changed climate so far is that we're seeing much greater warming in the northern part of the Midwest than the southern part of the Midwest. And we see more warming in the wintertime than we do in the summertime. So there are some differences in how this has played out so far. And so that's important to keep in mind as we move forward. And this is just kind of a quick look out ahead. By mid-century is the top section of panels. In the late 21st century is the bottom two maps there. By mid-century, most of the models are showing warming by about 4 to 5 degrees, regardless of the scenario. By the end of the century, you really see the split between the low scenario and the high scenario. And the low scenarios is if we start doing things to really cut back on emissions. The high scenario is kind of continuing on the trajectory that we're on right now. So you can see a big difference between doing nothing and doing something about future emission levels. If we look at annual precipitation, this is probably the one that's we've really experienced a lot of and have the biggest impacts in the Midwest right now are the increases in precipitation. This is the annual precipitation. It's increased by about 10 to 15% or more across the Midwest and really across the central U.S. So we're seeing lots of impacts, and especially this year, we really felt the impacts of those. Also, we're seeing more or an increase in the heavier rain events. So it's not that when we say it's increasing by 10 to 20% or 15% on the annual precipitation, it's not because every rain event is getting 10% more production. It's that we're seeing an overall increase in the heavier rain events. So the 2, the 4, 6-inch rainfalls, those are the ones that are really driving the numbers. And that's very problematic because those are the ones that typically cause the most catastrophic flooding, soil erosion, and so forth. So in this panel here, we've got on the left-hand side, we've got the increase in the heaviest 1% events. So that's the really top rainstorms or precipitation events. And those have increased quite a bit over the 20th century and now first part of the 21st century. And those are expected to continue to increase into the future. In fact, the reports are pretty much indicate that, we have fairly high confidence now that these heavy rain events are going to continue on into the future. If you look at the outlooks on overall precipitation, so as annual precipitation, for the most part, the indications are that we're going to see increases to continue in the winter and spring months. Summer, maybe a pullback in summertime precipitation, and fall's kind of the undecided season at this point. The key point is that we've seen these increases in winter and springtime precipitation. They're expected to continue on into the future in the mid to late 20th century. So for the report, we broke it down into 6 key messages, and we did a special case study on the Great Lakes region. So I'll step through each of these, and we'll kind of tie it back, even though some of these are, like, for example, agriculture, there are some messages that also come into play for national parks as well. One is that, and it's something we've observed, and it's been a problem, and it'll continue, is that the increase in the humidity and precipitation, eroded soils, flooded fields, created favorable conditions for pests and pathogens. And also without any kind of major technology and cultivation changes, we're going to see big changes in agriculture production into the future. So there's adaptation in that regard. But that also applies to the natural environment as well as in that we're seeing this increased precipitation and humidity levels and the spread of pests and pathogens that also could be problematic in the natural environment. Now, related to that, we do have conservation practices around the Midwest. This is one that we featured in the report. It's from Iowa State University, where they actually use native prairie vegetation to control erosion and nutrient loss in the fields. And it's kind of a win-win situation in that it's reducing those problems, but it also gives us more natural vegetation that's good for pollinators and the natural environment. So it's both good for agriculture and the natural environment. So it's a very successful program, and we hope to see it used more often. One of the other things that we have seen more frequently in the Midwest is these situations of a mild winter in a warm early spring, and it actually paradoxically increases the risk from frost damage. So we see it a lot in apples and peach crops because those are things we actually measure. But during these episodes, any kind of plant life, if it breaks dormancy too early, and then it gets hammered by a frost in a normal time frame of around April or so, it can damage the reproductive capability of the plant. So this is something that we can actually measure economically in the cultivated crops, but it also plays out in the natural environment as well. Also, there's been a change in the length of the growing season between the last spring frost and the first fall frost, and it's increased by about 2 or more weeks across the U.S. and across the Midwest in the last 100 years or so. And so most of that increase has come with an earlier spring. So we're seeing as we get milder winters, you get a little jump start on those spring conditions. And so it gives us longer growing season, also gives us a longer season in the natural environment as well, which can be both good and bad. If it's things you want to grow, that's good news. If it's things you don't want to grow, it's bad news, including extra pest cycles and things like that. We look at forestry. We had a couple of experts on forestry on the panel there from the U.S. Forest Service. And there's the continuing threat of the changing climate that also interacts with the things such as invasive species and pests that's increasing the tree mortality and reducing productivity across the Midwest. And then we'll see some of these economically and culturally important tree species might actually start to lose out in the Midwest. So there's a lot of concern about that. I'm not the expert on it, although I do like trees. But one of the things that we highlighted in this report was, and this is one of my favorites, is the Menominee Tribe up in Wisconsin. They actually have an economic enterprise there, where as they lost forest from the oak wilt disease, they actually replaced it with an anticipation of future climate conditions. So they change out some of the species so that they can actually get things that'll tolerate the warmer conditions or thrive better in warmer conditions as they move forward. So this is something that they did. It wasn't a federal thing. It was actually something they took upon themselves, and they worked with the Forest Service to flesh this out. But the idea is that they're planning for the long-term future on the order of 7 generations. So that's a pretty forward-looking program there for addressing climate change, and certainly lots of lessons there for adapting to climate change beyond just the next 1 or 2 cycles. Also with biodiversity and ecosystems, naturally, those are very important across the Midwest, especially the Great Lakes region. I'd say probably that's some biggest concentrations there. And they actually have very many benefits, especially the wetlands. I think those are probably one of the most obvious connections there with being a benefit from climate change. So we talk about warming temperatures and heavier rainfalls and more runoff. Those can certainly be used to address some of those issues. In fact, actually, I'll touch on that again in a second here, but while we're on the subject of ecosystems, one of the things we featured in there was things like coldwater fish that are at risk from warming temperatures. So there's a lot going on in this graph. And on the top panels there, we're looking at water temperatures in the top row. And the second row, we're looking at dissolved oxygen limits, so low limits on the reds there. And so what happens with cold water species, they're very happy in the cooler months of the year, but as summer and early fall progresses, the temperatures warm and the dissolved oxygen limits start to expand, so they kind of get sandwiched there, but they're able to survive until the temperatures cool off during the present day climate. When we get into the future, where it might actually get to be in the August, September time frame, they may actually get squeezed out from both ends, from too low of oxygen on the bottoms and then too warm on top. And so it actually wipes out the species. And of course, it doesn't take 30 years of that to happen. It only has to happen 1 or 2 years, and you pretty much are done with a cold water species. So this is a concern in the Great Lakes and any cold water fish habitat in the Midwest at this point. Oh, getting back to the wetlands, this is an example of one that we highlighted from Ohio, where they took about 100 acres of cropland along Lake Erie, and then in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and Ducks Unlimited, they converted it back into wetlands. This does two things. One, it takes farm production out of the area that drains right into Lake Erie, which has been problematic in recent years when you have big rains flush nutrients off into the lake and causing big algae blooms. So it takes that out of the equation, and also when you restore it to wetlands, that obviously provides habitat and for both wildlife and fish. So this is one that we like to highlight just because it is done in conjunction with two conservation groups. In terms of health, the reason I brought this up was that I'm sure you and your staff are going to be outside. We hope for the long term. So there are concerns on the horizon on health threats, including the frequency and intensity of the poor air quality days. And there we're talking about ozone days, where you have really high ozone levels that are at the surface, which are highly correlated with high temperatures during the summertime. Also going to have extreme heat events and the heavy rainfalls that we already talked about, as well as extended pollen season and extended season and distribution of the disease-carrying pests and insects. Things like the mosquitoes and the ticks are going to be more problematic into the future. So we list quite a few health-related concerns there, especially for anybody that works outdoors. For transportation infrastructure, I just wanted to mention here that while we focus mostly on urban infrastructure, this is also true of infrastructure and the more outside of the urban environment. And I'm sure you folks are having to address things like eroded roadways and flooded roadways and bridges and so forth. So any kind of infrastructure is going to have to be beefed up to address these issues, especially with the heavy precipitation events and elevated flood risk. And so this year is probably the poster child for dealing with those kinds of things across the Midwest, where we had exceptionally wet conditions for many months there. This is a snapshot of Davenport, Iowa, that underscores some of the disruption to transportation. Again, that's probably not a direct impact on your operations, but again, that's within the park, you can have disruptions of transportation as well. Finally, we talked about community vulnerability and adaptation, and especially low-income communities are especially vulnerable to climate change and all of its aspects. And we're especially concerned about tribal nations, because not only do they have those issues that everybody else has, but in addition, they have cultural ties to the landscape that many of the rest of us don't necessarily have. This is a story that came out last year talking about wild rice, and it was featured on NPR. And there's tribes up along the Great Lakes there that this is part of their long-term cultural tradition to go out and harvest wild rice. And when it gets warming temperatures across the Midwest, especially in the wintertime, that's starting to drive out the wild rice and replace it with, you have new invasive species coming in and competing with it. So it's really problematic. And you can run into the scenario at some point there where may not be any wild rice, and so then you've lost that cultural tie. So there's those kinds of concerns going forward as well. Also spent a lot of time talking about the changing Great Lakes, and in a thumbnail sketch, we know that the Great Lakes, the water temperature is getting warmer, and the ice cover duration is getting shorter in the wintertime. So there's those things coming into play, but we also have some competing changes. So we've got, along with warmer temperatures of the lakes, we're getting higher evaporation rates. But at the same time, we're also getting more of the heavy rain events, so that's putting more runoff into the lakes. And so there's kind of this tug of war going on with lake levels right now. So if we talked a couple of years ago, we would have been talking about the low lake levels, and now we're talking about the record high lake levels. And it's kind of a little bit undecided about how that's going to play out into the future. The latest research shows that there might be a slight decrease in lake levels on into the future, but I think probably the safest thing we can say right now is it's going to remain highly variable moving forward. Finally, I wanted to say, this has just come out in the last couple of days. There's the Climate.gov has a website on with the toolkits for various regions, and these have case studies and tools and identify expertise, and as well as reports within each region in the United States. And we just finished the Midwest region just a couple of days ago, so I wanted to bring that to your attention. And there's the web link on the top of the page there, so you can you can go in there and look at more case studies like the ones we talked about today. Finally, just kind of, this is really a philosophical question that came up during the discussion when we were writing the report, and that's what we consider native species. This is probably one of the most visible ones that I've seen here in Illinois. 30 years ago, it would have been unheard of to see an armadillo in Illinois. That would have been a real curiosity. Now they're getting to be somewhat common in the southern part of the state. And we've just in the last year or two have had reports of them in central Illinois, which is where I live. So they've already started to expand. Probably cold winter weather will set them back a little bit. But I think one thing we'll have to think about moving forward is, what do we consider the native species in our parks as they come with a warmer and wetter climate with perhaps a totally different sequence of climate events moving forward. So I think that's something it's going to be very dynamic. In fact, if the models are any indication that what we've seen so far, at least in temperatures, are actually going to be, so far, have been fairly moderate, and it's going to be even more a more rapid rise as we move on into the future. So I think we're going to see more changes like this, and at some point, when our couple of generations will just say, well, yeah, the armadillos are native to the Midwest. So we'll have to see how that one plays out. So I think if takeaways for today, I think probably the ones that we've seen so far have been with the trend towards wetter conditions brought on by these heavy rain events. And the future challenge is actually going to be more with the increased temperatures and extreme heat. And that we've got adaptation and mitigation efforts underway right now, but much more is needed. Most of these are right now just case studies, and we really need to expand them out to really have a big impact. So with that, I'll hit the other button. And I thank you for your time today. And here's the link to the National Climate Assessment, the full report. You can also Google it by just saying National Climate Assessment 2018.
That is excellent, Jim. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to pull back presenter role from you for just a moment. And I want to take a second and just pause here because your presentation has got so much in it that may be relevant to the folks that are on the line with us today. Everything from the variability of water levels within the Great Lakes, the interplay between the lengthening growing season versus increasing risk of frost damage, which I thought was really intriguing. And we're all in this room kind of geeking out over your visualization that you showed about the interplay between water temperature, dissolved oxygen, and fish populations. So there's a lot to talk about here, and I want to give our participants a second to raise their hand, ask any questions they might have, or submit questions via chat box. This is your chance to do so right now. So bear with us, Jen. Got a couple things happening here.
Yes, Wendy is asking if we could put the link to the toolkit back up.
Sure.
Actually, Jim, I'm going to make you presenter one more time so you can show that on your end, if that's all right.
All right. So that was good timing because that literally just was released, I think, earlier this last week. So just in time delivery.
All right. And we'll try to replicate that within our chat box down below, so you can have an easy way to click on that. I did see that we got another question coming in here. If wildlife and plant life adapt to a changing climate by moving north, are they still, oh gosh, sorry, let me pop this out so I can see this a little bit better. Roberta, thanks for your question, and here it is. If wildlife and plant life adapt to a changing climate by moving north, are they still viewed as invasive non-natives in need of removal, or will they be viewed as a species trying to adapt and in need of protection? Love it. Is this along the lines of what you were talking about, Jim?
Yeah, that was along the lines of what I was thinking of there. That what do we consider native and non-native, and if the climate is changing and changing rapidly, it means the species composition will also change rapidly as well. So, yeah, I don't have an answer for that.
It's going to be a tough one. It's one we're going to grapple with. Many of our folks are beginning to think about what large-scale transformation of ecosystems looks like and how we sort of view those changes and define those changes. And certainly it's an important conversation to have when we talk about restoring ecosystems, wetlands, back to a natural state. Well, what does that mean in a future that is rapidly moving outside the range of any natural variability? So it's a cool thing to think about. And I've got another question here for you, Jim, from Terry. Are we currently seeing an impact of fish populations as a result of changes in water temperature and dissolved oxygen? Is what you put on that screen sort of playing out demonstrably in the real world?
Yeah, and this is outside of my area of expertise, other than I've done a little fishing, but talking with the experts that we talked to in this, that was indeed the case, and this was kind of the graph I showed was kind of the idealized case of that playing out, but I think they're actually having that problem in some of the lakes. Now, the Great Lakes are big enough that it's going to take a while for that to play out, but some of the smaller lakes, I think they're already seeing that kind of pressure play out.
Excellent.
I have a question here from Janet. Thinking about forests and deforestation, can we change the CO2 levels by focusing on including forest strips in conservation farming, a concept of agroforestry that is being done in other parts of the world?
Yeah, that is a possibility. Forests are very good at sequestering carbon, and reintroducing some of that back into the Midwest would certainly be beneficial, especially on lands that are kind of marginal anyway for cropland. So that I don't know if we could do it on a large enough scale, at least in the Midwest, to make a large impact, but it certainly would help in sequestering carbon.
And I will throw out there, if anyone wants to weigh in on what we call invasive species in the future, you're welcome to raise your hand. We'll unmute you and you can offer your ideas. John has already suggested we just call these things invasive natives, given that we can't do much about the changes to the climate that are already in motion. So there's one suggestion for our philosophical question. Excellent. Jim, I'm going to go ahead and move along to our panel presenters at this time. For everyone that's participating right now, continue to enter in your questions into the questions box or raise your hand, and we can bring you in at any point in time. But for right now, what I'd like to do is move along. I'm going to show you a quick summary of the key takeaways from Jim's presentation, his summary points. We'll revisit these at the end of the presentation. But for right now, I'd like to go ahead and introduce my colleague, Mr. Gregor Schuurman. Gregor is an ecologist with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program here in Fort Collins, where he works with national parks and stakeholders to develop climate change adaptation strategies. He most recently worked with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources on climate change vulnerability assessments and adaptation and monitoring and management for rare species, and previously worked as a scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey studying the climate change sensitivity of rare species in Hawaii volcanoes and Haleakala National Parks. Gregor's deeper history is in southern Africa, where he grew up for the first decade of his life and returned there for his graduate fieldwork. He earned his master's degree at the University of Minnesota and his PhD at the University of Washington. So Gregor, thanks again for taking the time and joining us today. And I'm going to pass it to you to introduce our panel.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry. And thank you, Jim, for a really great presentation. As my bio mentions, I worked in the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for a number of years before working for the Park Service, so it's a landscape I'm familiar with and appreciated that summary. And I am excited to have brought two real leaders in climate change adaptation and understanding and motivating others. And so I'm just going to describe the two of them, working from west to east, which is the way we're going to do these presentations. So first, from northwestern Wisconsin, in Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, in Lake Superior, is Peggy Burkman. Peggy is a biologist with the park, and she has a long-term interest in understanding and adapting to climate change and motivating others to do the same, to become aware of climate change and respond to it. And she's worked for over a quarter century in the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service, and has been at Apostle Islands National Lakeshore since 2002. One of the interesting things about Peggy is, as part of her passion for communicating climate change, for adaptation, for motivating others, she went back to school just in the past decade, and she got herself completed an EDD organizational leadership degree. And appropriately enough, the dissertation topic for that degree, what she chose, was enhancing human motivation in group settings relative to climate change. Shifting eastward, and a bit of a contrast with Apostle Islands National Lakeshore in terms of setting, geography, and some of the issues the park deals with, is Cuyahoga Valley National Park and Lisa Petit, who's been there longer than Peggy's been at his. So we got a couple of long-timers here. Lisa's been in Cuyahoga since the year 2000. She's the Chief of Natural and Cultural Resource Stewardship of that program in the park, was formerly a wildlife biologist in the park. Her earlier career was at the Smithsonian Institution, where she was part of the Migratory Bird Center and worked on human impacts, particularly land use, on wildlife ecology, and understanding the role of protected areas in resource conservation. The final thing I want to say about Lisa and her team is that this is a 33,000-acre park. It's a decent-sized park, and they focus on the broader aspects of restoring and enhancing natural conditions within the park and on the river in particular, and celebrating an important anniversary recently in the recovery of the Cuyahoga Valley, which she'll be talking about. So let's turn it over to Peggy.
Excellent. And Peggy, I have just shot you presenter role, so you can share your screen at any time. And just make sure that your telephone is unmuted.
Is my screen set up there?
That looks great, Peggy.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. Apostle Islands is a beautiful place, and the reason I've stayed here for so long. The two takeaways from this park are there is a really interesting and fascinating balance of both cultural and natural resources. And the other thing is, the lake is the boss. You cannot think about this park without thinking about the lake. And so my slide is not advancing. There we go. Lake Superior is the largest lake in the world by area, over 20 million acres. And interestingly enough, it's also among the fastest warming lakes globally. On contrast, the park, the land-based acreage is a little over 42,000 acres, but because it's 21 islands in Lake Superior, it covers an area of about 450 square miles in size. We have about 160 miles of coastline, and islands range in size from a little tiny Gull Island at 2 acres all the way up to Stockton Island, which is 10,000 acres. And those islands are 1 to 15 miles from the mainland. Every island has an expression of the natural features you see listed on the left, and every island has a combination of some of the features in the cultural history listed on the right. And so what you end up with is each island has its own unique story that we like to think about. So some of the things we've noticed related to climate change in the past several years, starting with, there's researchers over in Duluth, Minnesota, which is on the western end of the lake, and they were using buoy data and found out that wind speeds have increased 5% per decade since the mid-1980s, and this is related to increasing lake temperatures and air temperatures. And then in addition, in the past several years, we've had increased very significant rainstorm events. We've had a 100-year event in both 2011 and 2016, a 500-year event in 2012, and last season a 1,000-year event. And these are rainstorm events that are supposed to occur, one every 100, 500, or 1,000 years. And yet we've had several of them in the last decade. We've also gotten to the point where annual winter storms are so common that we basically plan in the spring to go out and do a sweep of the islands looking for damage related to storms. And if you look at the picture in the lower left, that is a result of a storm that in 2014 basically opened up that lagoon to the lake. And that's about a 250-foot stretch of section that was blown out in a single storm. So some of these wind and rain events can be very damaging to not only the natural resources, but also we have, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of cultural resources in the park. And on the left-hand side, that upper picture, that sand, that's all being pushed up onto the beach. And actually, there's photos of sand going into that little cabin. In the lower left, that is the Devil's Island boathouse that's on the National Register of Historic Places. Received significant damage after a late fall storm a couple years ago. Infrastructure is also getting impacted. On the upper right, again, there's a push of sand. That's a campsite that photo shows. In the upper right portion, that dark brown is a picnic table. So that's probably almost a good foot of sand pushed up on that area. We have several docks in the park, and we're repeatedly having to address, damage to docks. And so I wanted to kind of shift gears here a little bit after giving that brief introduction on some of the impacts we've seen and talk about some of the things that we've done over time. We started off several years ago. We were an early adopter of the Climate Friendly Parks Initiative and developed an action plan with strategies and goals. And the interesting thing about that project was the park, being that it's 21 islands and electricity is not really possible, we have been using solar panels for decades. The park was established in 1970. And so that ended up playing well for us in our action plan, and because we were already accomplishing so much just with that initiative. The other part of that was interesting but not surprising was that our biggest impact was related to boat use, because boats are inherently inefficient in their use of fuel. We also, working with the NPS Climate Change Response Program, completed a scenario planning workshop with Gregor and some other staff, and we ended up identifying 4 scenarios, basically that could be the future, and one of those was basically steady state, that nothing changes. Then we also had one called steady change, one called soggy, and one called yo-yo. And we tried to give them names that people would easily remember them. But we got to the point with that effort where we had a much better understanding of what some potential scenarios were, and that enabled us to think about ways to respond to those different types of scenarios. We've also done a couple research projects with Northland College, just happens to be in one of the neighboring towns, and we have worked with them on, in just recent years, completing projects on rare plants and coastal wetlands, and have learned a lot about potential of climate change to affect those species. And hot off the presses this month, we just finished our climate change vulnerability assessment. We were able to get funding through the Park Service climate change source, and we worked with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. They're in Michigan Tech. They are a multi-agency and multi-state partnership. Does a lot of work in the northeastern part of the United States. Fantastic partners. In the spring, we will be doing our resource stewardship strategy, and at least for natural resources, we're feeling very well prepared with all of this effort to date. And I want to just drill down into our climate change vulnerability assessment a little bit more. We base that off of some larger assessments that same group, NIAX, has completed, and we scaled it down to the park, and that ended up being a really interesting exercise, and I'll get into that more in a minute. We wanted to look at some very specific questions on related to vulnerability and on terrestrial features and natural communities in the park. There was mention earlier about species moving northward, and when you're 21 islands in Lake Superior, that's a real challenge. Some tree and plant seeds do have capacity to, make that migration, but some don't. And so that is a real question for us. We were also interested in whether or not the park could serve as a refugia for certain species, because it already is doing that. And I mentioned the barrier potential for the lake. And then one of the things, too, that we were thinking about is with all of this increased wind speeds and, change over time, does that have the potential to alter our natural disturbance regimes, the long-term, in this very marine environment has been predominantly wind is the major disturbance in the bulk of the park, although there are a couple areas where fire is more likely to occur. And I mentioned we worked with NIAX. The process we used was also based on a process that they have been using, and it involves a literature review and modeling, which they did a fantastic job on. We projected to the end of the century, used a national statistically downscaled model in both the 4.5 and 8.5 scenarios. And we also laid a regional dynamically downscaled model on top of that to validate. And those two, using those two models was very helpful. We used the USDA Tree Atlas, and we modeled down to a scale of 1 by 1 degree, which is much smaller than what you see on the modeling results. And you can see those are for both temperature and precipitation, and both the RCP 4.5 on the left and the RCP 8.5 on the right. I'm real interested to share this information with some of our local partners, because that 1 by 1 degree area included several lands of adjacent landowners, and so we'll be looking forward here in the short term to getting some of that information out with them. And our vulnerability assessment results, we worked with our expert panel and identified a group of ecosystems that represented the park the best. You can see those on the far left. And then for each ecosystem, we identified the potential impacts, the adaptive capacity, and the vulnerability. And that vulnerability was focused on whether or not a particular area or ecosystem would, if there would be changes that would lead to an entire different ecological state, if there would have been changes to function, in that an ecosystem would not be able to function the way that it had previously, and if there were going to be any issues related to the health, productivity, or even the geographic extent of a habitat. So that vulnerability portion has a lot in it. And then you see the column called evidence, agreement, and confidence. Evidence was more how available, how much information we felt was out there, and then agreement was how well we felt that we agreed with one another, and assessing the vulnerability of these systems. And then the confidence was how confident we were in our assessments and in the data. And it's interesting because going into this, I had expected, based on some work I had done with prior to this effort, that we would have more highly vulnerable ecosystem types. And in talking with the folks from NIAX, I think because we scaled this down to that 1 by 1 degree area, that made a difference in some of the vulnerabilities. And so there's a lot in that table, but it was very, very useful. We have a couple things that we're still trying to tease out a little bit, one of which is whether or not we will reach some tipping points where combinations of lake level and storms will just push certain ecosystems beyond a certain point from which they can't recover. So the first two things I've got listed here, the interpretive component and the demonstration project, these are still related to our climate change vulnerability assessment, and those are things that we're working on right now. And I mentioned the resource stewardship strategy earlier, and that is something that we're going to roll all of this information into, and I think it will be a very successful project. And if I'm not mistaken, yep, that is all I had.
Thank you, Peggy. And yeah, I'm excited about the RSS that you're going to pull all of this stuff into and seeing how that comes together. We are going to pivot here and go straight to Lisa, and then we will take questions after Lisa's presentation. Just making the switch over here.
All right, Lisa, we are seeing your presentation. Just make sure that your phone is off mute. All right, we can hear you.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much. I am very excited to be able to talk to you all about some of the things we're doing at Cuyahoga Valley National Park. I would characterize it as a full transformation of ourselves, and that transformation is going to help us as we deal with many of the challenges that climate change brings for us. I could talk about almost all the things that Jim presented as challenges from climate change in the future, but I'm going to focus primarily on flooding and precipitation. But I first just wanted to let you know where we are. So this is Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which was established in 1974 as a national recreation area initially. It was renamed in 2000 as a national park. It's located between the cities of Cleveland and Akron, right south of Lake Erie there in the upper northeast corner of Ohio. And it's part of a crooked river. The Cuyahoga means crooked river because it starts headwaters in the north, flows south, takes a hairpin turn at Akron, and flows north again to Lake Erie. So it's a primary tributary of Lake Erie. And the park encompasses about 22 miles of river. The park itself, the legislative boundary surrounds 33,000 acres, but only about 20,000 acres are owned by the NPS. And you see from this slide on the left, it's a real mosaic of ownership, but the primary other landowners are county-level metro park districts. The park is pretty narrow, following that valley, the river valley of the Cuyahoga, and a couple of major tributaries that come into the Cuyahoga. We have 21 tributaries that empty into the Cuyahoga within the boundary of the national park. And it's a very steep walled valley, so it's a narrow park just following that valley wall, essentially. And along the river, we are hemmed in, essentially, by two major assets for the park facilities. The first was the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railway, a historic district along the Valley Railway, and the Ohio and Erie Canal, and the towpath trail that follows that, which we created in the 90s as a recreational trail along the historic alignment of that towpath. So those two major assets follow the river on both sides. We're famous, or infamous, the Cuyahoga River, as one of the emblems of terrible urban industrial pollution. that actually sparked, the birth of the Clean Water Act. The river burned multiple times in the 50s and 60s, and we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the 69 burning of the river, which was a celebration really of 50 years of an amazing recovery of that river. The river, of course, because of that state of pollution, is one of 43 areas of concern for the Great Lakes. You can see in this slide the lower Cuyahoga, which does encompass the national park right in the middle, is an area of concern of an impaired waterway. But again, 50 years of an amazing environmental success story, and the park staff have embraced this environmental recovery in a 5-year strategic plan, and we want to ensure that that success continues and improves the situation, the watershed, the health of that watershed. And we're doing that in a number of ways. It's been a long time and a lot of hurdles, but climate change only will add to those hurdles, and you've already heard in many ways how that happens. For us, the primary threat from climate change is increased risk of flooding, increased impacts from flooding, from increased precipitation rates. And this is, you've already seen what Jim presented, but this is just some local data that demonstrates that we had increasing precipitation amounts and frequency after, in this case, this is a local area after, in the 2000s. Jim actually showed that it started right about the time that the park was established. But in the 2000s, we began to encounter serious flooding events, very frequent flooding events from large amounts of flow and discharge in the river. These are data from the Army Corps of Engineers for the park, and this is just demonstrating that indeed between the establishment of the park in 1974, before that and compared to after that, flows within the Cuyahoga River have increased by, around 23 to 32% for different recurrence intervals, the 1 year or the 500-year event. And that was true, also is true for most of our tributaries. These are 2 tributaries that are actually showing those incredible increases in flows. And so that has obviously resulted in those major flooding events that cause huge damage to our infrastructure and to the park resources. And we've actually, since I've been here, since 2000, we've had at least 5 major events where we've had to recoup emergency funding for millions and millions of dollars of repair of the railroad, the towpath, and other areas. You can see the rail is just suspended in midair after erosion from a big flooding event. So obviously we were sort of encountering these kinds of stormwater issues before we really started to have climate change impacts really seriously, but it's mostly because we're at the base of a steep valley, or a steep-walled valley, and also at the base of this watershed in general. And also land cover has really changed dramatically over the last few decades, where forest cover in the entire Cuyahoga watershed has gone from 40% down to 33%, and then developed land has changed in the opposite direction. So we actually swapped developed land and forested land in the entire watershed. Now, within the park, we have about a 60% forest cover. If we look at the imperviousness, and we know imperviousness is related to the health of stream quality through biology, the fish populations, the macroinvertebrate populations. So if you have your highest quality or your best healthy streams are when you have imperviousness below 10%. So we've coded it here as green, yellow, red, and all the development is on the outside of the boundary of the park, with most of the green space and forest cover on the inside of the boundary of the park. So that's good news, at least within the boundary of the park. But you can see here from the watersheds that are all around us, they prevent essentially us from, we don't have a lot of control over the streams on the inside of the park because they're parts of watersheds that are impacted outside of the park. But we have tried to address this. The stormwater is a tremendous problem, which I'll go into in a minute, but we've tried to address this in many ways, even down in the park, by addressing some of our own runoff issues. And these are a couple of examples of projects that we've undertaken just recently with funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation through our partner association, the Friends Group. And this is some of that green infrastructure we've talked about, where we're putting in recharge tanks that would go along both sides of one of our major parking areas right next to the river. And this would allow the runoff coming in to filter into these storage tanks and then filter out more gradually so that we don't have sheet flow directly or even piped directly to the river, which is what's happening in other places. So that should help with the stormwater in certain locations where we can do it. In another location, we have another effort to manage stormwater in the location, and this is a parking lot shown here at a very popular trail area where most of the area is actually cleared of forest right now. And we're putting in a wetland detention area, a natural wetland system to help with stormwater containment, and then also a series of step pools that are going to slow down water through the site. In addition, we're going to plant and reforest diverse native trees across all of the green areas that you see there. So these are all multiple ways that we will try to address stormwater issues in various locations in the park. With those tributaries that are having the increased flows from increased precipitation, we have a lot of sedimentation happening, and so virtually everywhere in the roads at the bottom of the valley, they're all filled with sediments, and they become clogged, and then you have flooding in the communities on all their roads. And of course, that seems to the average member of the public that that's the park's fault because this didn't happen before we were there. So that's kind of joking, but at the same time, the public doesn't quite understand how it all works. So we have a public education issue there. This is just to show a little bit of what has happened on the landscape. This is one of our major tributaries, Furnace Run. It is, again, taking extremely high flows, and it especially happened after an interchange, a highway interchange happened upstream and other residential developments. So then we have a lot more stormwater coming down in. And this is the picture at the top of 1994 compared to 2012. And what has happened is that trying to find equilibrium with those increased flows, incredible erosion is happening as the stream tries to lengthened and has created new meanders, which you can see here, the amount of erosion and the amount of shift in this lower right-hand picture over since 1990, actually that's 1951 up to 2012, I believe. So in this case, in this landscape, there is room for this stream to lengthen, and then it hits this nice little block with the railroad and a road bridge that has contributed to some of this seeking equilibrium. Well, the river is doing the very same thing, only over time the river is hemmed in by the railroad and the towpath trail and roads that are along those, like Riverview Road. And so the river cannot actually lengthen the way it wants to. And over the last 3 or 4 decades, the river has actually shortened instead of lengthened because of the erosion that's happening and sediment loads that it's carrying. And so we're very excited because as a part of the attempts to delist the river from the area of concern, we have partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers out of the Buffalo District with funding from the US EPA toward the AOC, the area of concern, to take on a very large-scale river restoration effort that is going to involve a number of techniques to improve floodplain access and other and minimize erosion, but to allow the river to accept the higher flows that it is receiving. We will actually lengthen the river by creating meanders in areas where we can. And we're lengthening the river over actually probably 5 or 6 miles at least by more than 2,000 feet of linear feet of river. These are conceptual designs at this point, but that is where we have arrived, in that we feel that that's the best way to assist the river. Overall, though, the health of the watershed is also going to be improved by improving the amount of forest cover that we have within the boundary of the park, especially along the riparian areas of the streams and the river. And this is actually a view, we can dream. This is actually a view of the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, the Cuyahoga Valley, from one of the elevated highway bridges. And so it looks as though a vast forest exists there, and that's what we want to actually improve. So we are growing currently tens of thousands of native plants of all kinds in order to help us with our reforestation and our wetland restoration and other restoration that we're doing, native plants, native grasses, and that sort of thing. And we're growing that in our own greenhouses. And then we have legions of volunteers, which is one of the benefits of being in an area like this. We have for park-wide, we have over 7,000 volunteers that contribute 200,000 hours every year. And a vast majority of them actually contribute their time to these kinds of reforestation efforts. And so that is really what's going to help the watershed in terms of stormwater management, as well as other habitat values as we go forward with climate change challenges. It's also going to assist us in maintaining a high-quality habitats. It's a high-quality migration corridor along the river that the national park and adjoining metro parks lands provides for especially neotropical migrants as they either cross going north or south, coming from Point Pelee, say, or across Lake Erie in their migration routes. Some of those migratory birds are identified as, in peril and potentially would be extirpated from the region with increasing climate change. And so hopefully we can maintain good habitat. We are also concerned, but don't have great plans yet for how we deal with certain vulnerable species. In our case, the eastern hemlock is a species that we know is susceptible to problems with climate change and especially with temperature change, and they are probably right now occurring as somewhat like refugia in the cool, moist ravines and the outcroppings that occur throughout the park. That is a species we really want to try and maintain here if we can. And so we have a number of, they're very vulnerable to pests right now. So we are trying to develop a plan to assist with those. But those are the main issues we're dealing with. And I thank everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Lisa, so much good content, and oh my gosh, so much amazing work going on at both Cuyahoga and Apostle Islands. We have a little bit of time here for some questions. We've got a number of participants still hanging with us, and so I want to afford an opportunity. Would love to hear from you, our participants. Are you seeing something similar in your parks? Are there points of agreement or differentiation between what you're seeing at your unit versus what you're seeing take place at both Apostle Islands or Cuyahoga, or in the larger region? We're lighting up the cameras right now for everybody, including Jim, who has kindly stuck with us throughout the latter part of the presentation. We appreciate that. And I invite you to submit questions through the questions panel if you so choose, but I would love to have you raise your hand if you want to bring your voice into the conversation as well. We can do that. But I know that Gregor is sitting across from me, and he's had a burning desire to ask questions all through this presentation. So Gregor, I'll kick it off to you for an initial round.
Right, sort of a broad one, and I would invite you to respond to this one. You guys in your parks are obviously leaders. You're really switch on to this, and you have been for years, and you've got a lot that you've accomplished, which is why you're here. But you're also interested in inspiring others. And so my question is, for a park that sort of gets it, that climate change matters, and has some inkling that maybe there are going to be some challenges, how do they get started? How did you all get started? What would you tell a park today about how they get on board thinking about climate change and responding to it?
Well, I can go first, I guess. I feel as though we had to really prioritize what our main focus was going to be. There are so many things that are happening all the time, and so many ways that these protected areas are being threatened, that it's easy to get totally distracted or just diffuse in your attention to things. In some ways, climate change issues, if you can focus on the primary threats to your resources, that might help focus your attention and your efforts. By focusing our attention and our efforts in Cuyahoga Valley, we have really been able to take opportunities to partner with really important partners who are going to help us move the needle on some of these big, hairy issues that seemed like they were never going to be able to be addressed. And so I think that that's one thing I would say, is really try to focus on the most important threats and possibly where you can have the greatest impact in addressing those.
Yeah, and Gregor, couple things. One is we took advantage of some of the National Park Service initiatives and, the scenario planning and the climate change vulnerability assessment effort. And those ended up being very, very helpful in helping us identify what vulnerabilities we're facing. But then also we're in an area that in Wisconsin is actually pretty well known for partnerships. And we have a lot of folks landowners and partners that are experiencing very similar things that we are, because we all have the Great Lake in common. And so, exploring some of these issues with our partners and identifying ways that we can work together to try to deal with some of the issues has been very helpful for us.
Thank you both.
Excellent. Gregor, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask at this time?
I've got plenty of things that I want to ask.
Fire one off if you so choose.
I got another one. Peggy, just let me follow with that issue of sort of recognizing that neighbors have similar concerns. Can you talk a little bit about linking with your neighbors and about what you do across the fence collectively in your area, whether that's municipalities, tribes, counties, whatever?
We work with a wide variety of folks, and you mentioned a few. We have tribal partners on either end of the park, and sometimes it's just a matter of trying to understand what is going on, and then also sharing that information, making sure that all partners get that, detail. And sometimes we might try to share not only information, but we might try to share, maybe try to hire seasonal staff collectively that work on various projects, and that kind of thing has been helpful. We've also partnered with some of the universities in the area, and again, a lot of it is just trying to understand, because the Lake Superior watershed is very complicated, and so at some points we're still at that understanding level.
Yeah, that's sort of interesting, and I think a useful point in there is you guys might be off and away on one issue, and on another issue you're still busy trying to get enough information. So you may have, for instance, a pretty clear understanding of vulnerabilities of some of your terrestrial species, but you may still have some big questions out there about lake levels in Lake Superior in the future.
Yes, that's definitely one of them.
Lisa, do you have anything to add on that question? I know you guys are all about partnerships as well. I wondered how much of that you brought into climate change adaptation.
I think that one thing I didn't really talk about that much, it's one thing to partner with other agencies or organizations to help with restoration, but what is really going to be critical for this park is to engage the communities around us and to have them really embrace their role in stormwater management, in their participation in mitigating the flood impacts that are happening. I think that we have tried to engage them by having them understand that we're their national park and that they have a stake in how the park's resources are taken care of. And in that respect, that I think they will also learn that it takes care of their own resources and it helps mitigate their own flood risk. So we have a pretty enlightened population around this area, and yet there's more work to be done, and I think that's where we're going next. We'd like to really beef up our community engagement around this issue.
Thank you.
Excellent. And I'm watching the clock, and I'm cognizant that we're creeping up on the end of our time block here. And it is getting late in the afternoon, Central Time, cognizant of that. Some of our participants may be a little shy today, which is okay. Totally get that this is a little bit of a weird format to always ask questions. Fortunately, I really want to encourage all of our participants to follow up with our presenters and panelists as appropriate. They've already graciously agreed to share their contact information, and they're willing to follow up on any additional questions that you might have. Oh, do we? Oh, Melanie tells me we have late-breaking questions, so if you want to lob them, Melanie, go for it.
Okay, this question's from Roberta. She asks, The increase of non-permeable surfaces within watersheds where MPS sites exist is a common theme in the Midwest. The tech Lisa described is going to watch closely for applicability at other locations in the region. Thank you, everyone. Great job. That was a comment from Roberta. Terry then asks, I was wondering about Cuyahoga's work with neighbors related to reforestation. Sounds like they are engaging the community.
Yeah, we're definitely engaging the community very much through that volunteerism. I am constantly amazed at how many people want to devote their free time to helping plant trees. You know, they were devoting their time to pulling invasive plants, and we got more people involved when it was time to actually plant trees and reforest an area, which is another way that we're combating the invasive spread. So people are really, they love this park, they are giving of themselves to this park, and we would not be as successful without their help. We just had National Public Lands, Day of Service, and it was, I think we had 280 people out there on one of the sites I showed you, and they were just as efficient as could possibly be, and just planting, I think 600 or 1,000 trees. It's just really remarkable.
Okay, thank you. And Janet, I have a question on my chat box from you, and I'm going to try to unmute you and see if you could ask yourself. Okay, I think we can hear you.
Can you?
All right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I'm not sure how to unmute things. What I was wondering was kind of that follow along about the communication idea, and whether excuse me, your parks have any kind of meetings at regular intervals where you gather groups together, or is there any kind of a newsletter that the partner groups put together to send out periodically, or even questionnaires designed to draw more interested parties into the dialogue for your long-term projects? So how are you communicating? Is it regular? Is it written? Is it verbal? To speak to that.
This is Peggy, and our area has a lot of partners that might meet on a regular basis about other things, and so those conversations get woven into those. But there's not, to my knowledge, a concerted or regular mechanism right now in place. We've talked about trying to develop that type of a thing, but we're not there yet.
As in Cuyahoga, as far as our big projects go, or just generally, we've had a lot of interaction with the public, bringing them to open houses to talk through various initiatives we have, or to reveal to them what our thinking is about some of these projects. We need to do more of that. We do have a very active Friends group, the Conservancy for Cuyahoga Valley National Park, and they put out a wonderful newsletter to their members. So they often hold stories about what's going on in the park and these types of restoration activities. So we try to hit almost any kind of communication way, social media, printed newsletters, and also public open houses that we can, but we need to do more of it for sure, and we plan more of it in the coming winter months.
Thank you, Lisa and Peggy and Janet. Thank you very much for that question. I really appreciate it. We are going to have to bid adieu here momentarily. Before we do, I just want to really extend a note of gratitude and appreciation to all of our panelists and presenters today, as well as to those who have worked in the background behind the scenes to bring you this broadcast today. As soon as this broadcast ends, a pop-up is going to appear requesting your response to a very brief survey. So take a moment, please, to fill that out. Your responses really do help to improve each of these offerings going forward. And in the days ahead, you can expect a follow-up email from us with a link to the recorded webinar as well as contact information for all of our panelists and presenters today. And as a reminder, we'll be holding additional roundtables for each of the remaining NCA4 regions. Our final one wraps up this December, and we invite you to join those discussions as well as appropriate. So thanks very much for joining us today for the roundtable. We'll leave you with a reminder of your key takeaway from Jim's excellent presentation from the Midwest chapter. And we hope you all continue the dialogue, the great work happening in your parks, and have a great afternoon.